This is our second week of a 10-week boot camp. Last time we talked about what real love is and what real love is not. And toward the end, we started talking about the getting and protecting behaviors, all of which you can read about at length in pretty much all the books and DVDs and CDs on real love, because they're what we do all day long. Pretty much all the time, actually. And what we did not talk about last time is that all getting and protecting behaviors communicate simultaneously at least the following three messages, at minimum. So they all say, I don't love you. So, for example, let's go back. When I'm lying to you, is there any way that I'm caring about your happiness without any concern for myself? Well, no. How about when I'm attacking you? No, I don't love you. How about when I'm clinging? No, not loving you. Acting like a victim, not loving you. Angry at you, not loving you. So all the getting and protecting behaviors communicate, I don't love you. And until we get that, we're going to keep using them till hell freezes over and destroy our lives and our relationships. But they also communicate, perhaps less obvious to people, I don't feel loved. So when I'm angry at you and blowing up at you and criticizing you, it's pretty obvious. You can feel the, I don't love you. But when I'm angry at you, it's almost never that anybody has the courage or the sensitivity to sense that I'm also communicating, I don't feel loved. All we see is how it affects us. So not only are we selfish when we communicate with getting and protecting behaviors, but we're also incredibly selfish when we're the recipient of getting and protecting behaviors. So we have selfish plus selfish equals, awful, living in hell. The third thing that we communicate with getting and protecting behaviors simultaneously with the other two is, now that I've manipulated you with this particular getting and protecting behavior, now you have to love me. Now, that may be a little subtler for people to appreciate, but that's what we're saying. Otherwise, we wouldn't be using the getting and protecting behaviors. We're doing it precisely so that people will have to love us, or at the very least, not disapprove of us, which in many cases feels the same to us as love. So we manipulate people all the time, and we communicate messages that we don't realize we're communicating. How many times have I been talking to two people and one person has protected himself or herself, and I've turned to the person who is just protecting, they're just afraid, and said, do you realize how incredibly unloving and selfish that thing was? Well, no, they didn't. They'll say, for example, a husband said to his wife, do you realize what an ass you can be? And I said, do you realize how demeaning and critical and unloving that is, how attacking that is? And he said, well, no, I was just asking a question. He just wasn't sure if she knew that she was a real ass. Unbelievable. So we do this stuff all the time. I've said before in other places, we lie 3 to 5 times a minute, and that's just one of the getting and protecting behaviors. So if you were to add them all up, our lying, our attacking, our acting like victims, clinging, and so on, how many would that be? I mean, it'd just be beyond calculating. So here on the PowerPoint is the summary. I don't love you. I don't feel loved. Now that I've manipulated you, you have to love me. And so we have to understand that we're using these behaviors. And as we do, we'll finally unravel the mystery of pretty much all human behavior. We'll understand our interactions and relationships, and we talked a little bit about this last time. We'll understand why we don't feel loved unconditionally, because as long as we're using them, we are intimidating or manipulating or buying approval, or at least eliminating disapproval from other people, and we can't feel loved unconditionally if we're manipulating people. Once we recognize them, we can avoid repeating the same unproductive behaviors, and finally change the way that we see other people, feel about them, and respond to them. which brings us to, and I'm not going to tell the whole metaphor, the drowning metaphor. The short version of the drowning metaphor is that anybody who's using any version of the getting and protecting behaviors is simply drowning. And once you see that somebody's drowning, how can you be mad at them? How can you want to manipulate them? Your anger would instantly change to compassion. In fact, you'd even want to help them. So obviously we want to eliminate them. And one way is doing what we're doing right now, which is to understand real love and getting and protecting behaviors intellectually. That's the first step. Eliminating these behaviors is always a twofold process. The first is intellectual. Understand them, but that's not enough. So if you've got two people who are drowning in the water together with their hands around the other person's throat, it's not enough for one of them to go, oh, I get it now. Well, you're just drowning because you're still drowning. I'm sure that the people who were freezing to death, who had been pitched off the side of the Titanic, realized they were drowning, and that realization alone didn't warm them up or get them out of the water. So the second part of eliminating getting and protecting behaviors is we got to find the real love that will get us out of the water. And how do we do that? We're going to talk lots more about this subject later on, so not a whole lot now. We tell the truth about ourselves, which creates the opportunities to feel seen as we really are, to feel accepted, and to feel loved. Now, before we go on talking more about our behaviors and how to eliminate them, we need to understand how absolutely unbelievably sneaky our unloving behaviors are, and how rarely we are conscious of them. So often when I say to somebody, you're lying, and they look at me with just incredulously like, how could you say such a terrible thing? What it comes down to is they think that I'm telling them that they're intentionally lying. 99% of lies, I'd say roughly, might be as low as 98. Gee, that'd be different. The vast proportion of our lies are really quite unknown to us. We lie without thinking about it. We do things to win the approval of other people, and we're not aware that that's why we did it. How do we find out? Well, you do something for somebody else, and then you're disappointed when they're not grateful and they don't do something for you in return, or they don't recognize you in front of the group. That's when you realize that you were lying about your motivation. And see, most of us have been lying for so long, and I've had so many liars around us all our lives that even under those circumstances, we still are not conscious of our unloving behaviors. Now notice, rather than using the term getting and protecting behaviors, I rarely use that term. I just call it all unloving. They're all unloving, and they're just sneaky as can be. And if we're not consciously aware of them, if we don't work at being consciously aware of them, they will sneak back in. So I was talking to a couple 2 weeks ago. They were doing great. They'd never been happier in their lives. They were reading the marriage book together. They both reported that life was heaven. And I said, so stay aware of the behaviors that will change that condition. They both assured me that they would. And of course I thought, well, you won't. I mean, I don't stay aware of all of my unloving behaviors. If you turn to the side for a second, these behaviors will come out of the closet, really from the inertia of past experience, and they will bite you in the behind. They will. So we have to be watching for them. Now notice I said watching for them. We need to be conscious of them. That's far different from being afraid of them. So I need to be afraid that I'll do that again. No, you don't. Just be aware. That's enough. And it's not always necessary to identify the specific form of imitation love or getting and protecting behaviors. I attend real love groups rarely, but on the occasions that I do, I see this almost maniacal need, almost scientific concentration on correctly identifying the form of imitation love. People have, paradoxically, arguments, unloving arguments about identifying the correct getting and protecting behavior. It's just not all that important. So I find myself saying things like, do you realize that right now you're defending yourself? Can you feel yourself being defensive? Or I might say, you've been going on for the last 5 minutes explaining why you did a thing, why you behaved a certain way. Either one of those is a combination of power and victimhood and lying and sometimes attacking and sometimes clinging. And, our behaviors are rarely clean. It's rarely a single filament. It's really a tangled, nasty knot of a bunch of them. So we can just generally say, you're being defensive. Or I might say, you're afraid right now that I'm attacking you. So without meaning to, you're withdrawing from me and you're not feeling my efforts to love you. I talked to a young man earlier today, and he was very nearly at the suicidal stage. And the more he asked me, so what do I do not to feel like this? And as I really very gently, which I usually do with people who are suicidal, explained to him what he was doing, I could see him literally just back up away from me and cross his arms. And the scowl on his face became, even deeper. And I said, honey, you think I'm attacking you. So you're withdrawing. You're not trusting what I'm doing. How do you know? How do you know I am trusting you? Well, it's kind of obvious. The words alone really don't mean very much. It's how we behave. And the withdrawing can be a combination of victimhood and running and safety. And would it really help this kid who's contemplating blowing his brains out for me to say, now, primarily this is victimhood. This is about 40% victimhood, but there's 30% running involved. Not really. So we can describe in general terms, more general terms, what people are doing. Let me give you an example of just how sneaky our behaviors are. This is just one example. So a man called me and he'd been going to men's support groups in a national organization, in fact, of men's support groups and 12-step groups, Al-Anon and others. And I said, so what do you get at those meetings? And he said, oh, I get caring, I get connecting, I get support. And I said, because I've been to those meetings. It's kind of hard to tell me what the meetings are like and lie about it because I've been there. In fact, I had been to every one of the classification meetings that he described. So I said, my experience is that in these meetings, people act like they've been victimized by people and situations. They sympathize with each other. They don't genuinely love each other, which involves teaching, which involves helping people see behaviors that they would not otherwise recognize. In his men's group, for example, which I used to belong to years ago, they love expressing anger. I mean, a man expresses his anger in a violent way at his father who is not present or dead, and the men in the group will congratulate him for the honesty of his anger. So, there is a kind of connecting involved there, but they're connecting as victims, and they're supporting each other as victims. They're supporting each other in their victimhood. So his addiction was victimhood, and he had never identified it. because he had been actually victimized. I mean, his father had treated him badly and so on, but, gee, that's hardly rare. But it was a choice to act like a victim or to wallow in victimhood. But in his defense, he'd never seen that choice. And so most of us don't see these behaviors. As I was talking to somebody the other day, Robert Frost, I think, wrote the poem that said, you come to a fork in the road, and he said, and I chose the road less traveled by, and that's made all the difference. Well, but there's a kind of a myth to that. We use that poem to illustrate that there's always a choice. We believe that there's always a choice, and theoretically speaking, there is. But what if the road less traveled by, let's call it the right road in this case, is completely covered over with brambles and briars and trees? In fact, in some cases, trees 12 feet around, and boulders. And, well, you can't see the path. And so, as far as you're concerned, the path doesn't exist. If you can't see a path, it's not there. And so what appears to be free will or choice really isn't a choice. All we can do is take the road to the left, the wrong road, over and over and over again until somebody, say, cuts down a tree or clears a few of the brambles, or in some dramatic cases grabs us by the hand and drags us head over heels through the brambles, which may be painful but life-saving. So 12-step groups and other places like that can be good, but there's almost never confrontation. That's kind of a harsh word. Teaching, I guess. There's almost never teaching of the behaviors that we don't see. And so our sneaky, unloving behaviors continue. We get sympathy, but we don't get understanding. And it's absolutely critical that we get the understanding, and in some cases, the courage for somebody to reach over and just sort of, slap us awake. Our unloving behaviors are so sneaky that many people can use real love to get imitation love. So, for example, they will go to a real love group and then call me and proudly declare how well they had told the truth about themselves, how well they'd listened, and I can hardly stifle a chuckle. I mean, so you've been blind all of your life, but suddenly in the real love group, you can see everything clearly and you're proud of it. So you got a feeling of praise from it. It's very sneaky stuff. So people turn real love into imitation love. Hugging, for example, touching. I touch people a lot. I sit next to somebody, I put my hand on their knee. I'm sitting across from somebody, I touch them, I hold their hands. I touch people a lot. I hold people. And so many people in real love have mistakenly come to believe that the touching is somehow magical. And so they attempt to touch everybody, or they attempt to touch people before they're emotionally prepared to do it. And they turned it into something else. So hugging, for example, can be real love. Holding can be real love, but it can also be a way of delivering sympathy. Holding people can be a way that we get praised for being compassionate. It can be a way of exerting influence or power over other people. So we can turn anything into imitation love, like turning gold into lead. It's a common misconception, for example, that if somebody's having a difficult time in their lives, a very common expression that is spoken on the phone by many wise men and women, sometimes even by coaches, is, well, how many calls are you making? It's not about how many calls you're making. It's about how much unconditional love you're getting, which often involves some pretty uncomfortable moments where you hear the truth about these little sneaky behaviors that you have. So it's not about the number of calls, it's about the effect of the calls. Way better to make one call in a day where somebody truly loves you unconditionally, truly observes your behaviors that you don't see, teaches you, cares about you, is compassionate about you, than it is to make 10 calls with people who give you sympathy, who victimize with you, who attempt to fix you and give you advice. Much more effective to be powerfully loved once. So, kind of reiterating what I said just a little bit ago, don't get distracted too much by identifying imitation love and getting and protecting behaviors, because it really comes down to pain. At the root of all of them is pain. And, well, what's the pain? Well, the pain's just not complicated to identify. If we were insufficiently loved, which is true with almost all of us, it's so close to all that I just kind of say everybody. If we are insufficiently loved, then we feel empty, and we feel afraid, and we feel alone. And those conditions are always painful. So the root cause, you saw the diagram earlier of emptiness and fear lead to getting and protecting behaviors. Well, yeah, but before that is pain. And then after the pain come all of the getting and protecting behaviors. So don't get too distracted by labeling everything correctly. Just identify that somebody's in pain. If they're behaving badly, they're in pain. So we don't shoot them with arrows. We attempt to do whatever it takes to heal them. Now, touching them, putting a soothing balm on their wounds might occasionally be the thing to do. But in some cases, for example, I worked in emergency rooms for years and years, long enough to qualify with enough hours to have actually certified as an emergency room physician. In some cases, when somebody came in with, say, I saw a guy whose son accidentally shot him with an arrow, so he had an arrow sticking out of him, and he was in pain. Well, I could have given him something just for pain and sent him home. I could have put an antibiotic cream around the wound and sent him home. I could have done a lot of things that would have just made him feel better, but sometimes you actually have to operate and enlarge the wound in order for it to heal. And that's where wise men and women come into play. Learning when to teach, when to love and teach. It's usually both. And we're going to talk a whole lot about that more in a later week. So getting protecting behaviors, imitation love, come from pain. And it's all really pretty simple, all related to the same thing. Now, we've all heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's been in the news a great deal. People who come home from battle who were, quote, normal before they went to battle. And of course, you and I know better than that. Almost nobody is happy from childhood on up, but we'll just say average when they go to battle. And they come back so traumatized by what they saw, heard, felt, that it's like they're a different person. They experience so much pain that when they come back, they continue to react to the pain, to present pain, but mostly to the combination of past pain and present pain. So an example of PTSD would be a lady that I knew who had been raped in a stairwell and on concrete steps in a parking garage by a man who had recently eaten something containing garlic. I don't believe she knew what it was, but so he smelled like garlic, and he was wearing a red hooded sweatshirt. So for 20 years, she had been unable to walk into a parking garage, been unable to walk up concrete steps, unable to tolerate the color red, and couldn't stand the smell of garlic. Would have to walk right out of a restaurant where they used garlic for cooking, which is a pretty common ingredient. So for 20 years, she'd been reacting to an event that had lasted for 5 minutes. That's pretty dramatic. So the effect of pain can overwhelm pretty much everything else that's happened in our lives. Just as, if you and I were, this is in one of the books, you and I knew each other for 10 minutes, and for 9 of those minutes I was kind and sweet and solicitous and helpful, but for the last minute I chased you around the room with a knife. It doesn't average out. You would leave the room, and if somebody asked you how did it go, you wouldn't say, overall pretty good. Mostly good. No, you'd remember the minute of pain. Pain is awful. This lady, as a result of 5 minutes of trauma, her life had been ruined for 20 years. Most of us have been traumatized from birth. And because it's unremarkable, because it's the only thing we've ever known, because everybody around us has experienced the same pain or similar pain, we don't understand that almost all day, every day, we're reacting to the pain of childhood. So this woman's life, 20 years ruined for 5 minutes of pain as an adult. 5 minutes of pain as a child has been proven to register much worse. And yet most of us suffered pain throughout our childhood. Hence, my writing an entire book on real love and PCSD, or post-childhood stress disorder. The pain occurred in childhood and throughout our lives. And because it was inflicted early, we just assumed that it was normal. In fact, it's a rule that what we learn first tends to remain true. So that if you teach somebody something at a young enough age, that's it. No matter how many people contradict what a child learns at a sufficiently young age, they cannot convince the child of the truth. Children really almost are a blank slate, or what they used to say in Latin was a tabula rasa. And then we are written upon. We are almost created by our parents, which would, of course, make them creators, or to us, gods. I was stunned to learn recently how powerful our childhoods are. Now, I've always known that. I mean, gosh, I talk about it all the time. But I saw a graph that demonstrated the time at which our ability peaks to, for example, learn language. Had I guessed, I would have said that children learn languages most quickly at, say, age 4. Wrong. The greatest ability that children have to learn multiple languages is at 1 year. What's their peak ability? And I don't mean their only time that they can learn, but it's a bell curve, the place where that they are best able to learn new cognitive skills like, reasoning, logic. 2 years. At what age do children best learn emotional cues? Like, what does a facial expression mean? What does life feel like? Who are they? What are they worth? The age is 6 months. 6 months. So most kids by 6 months to 2 years, they're pretty much cemented. There was a man named Cesare Pavese who said, life is like adding a long list of numbers. If you're wrong with the first 2, the end result will be wrong. And we've all had that experience with a calculating machine or adding numbers in our head. You screw up the first 2 and you're dead for the rest. Pretty rare that you make a mistake later on that balances out the one that you started with. Childhood, then, is the lens through which we see everything else in our lives. So how were we all traumatized? How did it happen? It doesn't take a beating. It doesn't take sexual abuse. It doesn't take being hidden in a closet for, weeks at a time, although I've seen people who've had all those things done, or see your parents murdered in front of you, or it doesn't take something dramatic. All it takes is insufficient love. That's it. All a child has to do is be neglected. In fact, I often see greater trauma in the life of a child who's been simply neglected, because in addition to being traumatized, the child is also severely confused. If I punch you and your jaw hurts, your jaw's still going to hurt, but you ain't confused about it. You know why your jaw hurts. I hit you. If you yell at a child, they understand that what the cause of the pain is, or you hit them, or you throw them down the stairs. But if you just ignore a child, they can't identify the traumatic event. And so then later in life, when they're 40, 50, 60, the other day I saw a man 80 years old, and they say to me, well, how can my life be this screwed up? I was never beaten or any of these terrible things. No, you were just neglected. So sometimes I'll ask somebody right while I'm holding them, has anybody ever held you like this? We're not counting being held while you're in a rugby scrum or being held during sex. No, unconditionally loved and held. Never, ever happened. That's the most common answer. Big 6'5", 250-pound man laid down in my lap once in Phoenix, and he just sat there and cried like a baby, just silently sobbed. And he looked up at me and he touched my cheek and he said, "This is the first time I've ever been held." And to everybody around him, he looked competent, articulate, even tough at 6'5", 250 or 60 or whatever he was. It's pretty easy to look tough. But he had not had sufficient love. And so he felt empty and afraid, so he was in pain. So you can imagine the condition of his marriage and how he did as a parent. He really sucked at it. So as a result of the wounds that we experience just from insufficient love, we are taught. Now, nobody realizes that they're teaching this, but they still teach it. And I think I said this last week. One of my favorite excuses on earth is, well, I didn't mean to. Yeah, well, you didn't mean not to. And so we were taught, it wasn't knowing, but nobody meant to not do it either. We were taught that the world is painful, frightening, and not to be trusted. What else could you conclude from a childhood filled with pain? And so what is our reaction to a world that is like this, painful, frightening, that's not to be trusted? Well, duh. Our reactions are these behaviors. We lie. We attack. We act like victims. We cling. We run. We use praise, power, pleasure, safety. And we don't even know that we're doing it. We do it to survive. We do it to live. But in the process of living, in the process of simply surviving, we make thriving, we make happiness impossible. The very behaviors that enable us to survive. So, for example, in war, your rifle enables you to survive. You take it home and use it to solve your problems with your family, and it turns out that surviving isn't good enough. What you use to survive will kill people in other circumstances. General Patton was famous for being just one of the greatest warriors who ever lived. And in war, he was great in enabling his soldiers to survive. But as a husband and as a father and as a human being, he was just miserable. And when the war was over, he very nearly caused another one. They had to put him out of harm's way so that he wouldn't start another war. We can't use the same tools to be happy that we have used all these years to survive. And surviving is all we've ever known. because we're in pain. So all of these bad things that I'm talking about come from pain. So it's critical to understand our past, to understand our pain, to understand our getting and protecting behaviors, but we don't have to wallow in it. We don't have to go over and over our stories and tell them again and again and again. Those of you who have been here for interventions, for example, have discovered that I talk about your past, but that usually lasts for 15 or 20 minutes. In fact, there was a lady who was just here recently with her husband, and I talked to her husband a little bit about his past. But I realized on the third day of their intervention, I said, honey, I realized I haven't asked you a single question about your parents. Not about your father, not about your mother, not about what it was like for you as a child. I haven't asked you a single question about your past. And she looked at me and said, no, you didn't. And I said, do I need to? She said, no. Do I understand you? Uh-huh. I said, do you know how I understand you? I'm looking at your face. I'm looking at you. I've got the results of your past sitting in front of me. So analyzing it just ain't all that important. So we don't need to overanalyze it, and we don't need to stay in it. Remember this, the hole you're in is not your fault. You didn't dig it. You didn't fill it with mud. But you do now have the responsibility to get out of it. And you can't do it by yourself. That may sound a little scary, but it's actually a pretty cool thing. We need each other's help to get out of the hole that was dug for us and that we were thrown in and covered with mud. And it's kind of fun getting help, as long as we don't fight it. So, huge influence of the past. The past virtually determines the way that we live now and virtually determines the way that we're going to live in the future. Right? People commonly will say to me, they'll call me up and they'll say, now, I've been thinking. And now I don't do this all the time, but I very often will say, well, if you've been thinking, you're screwed. Because what you've been doing is your head was filled with crap from the time you were born, and every time you think, you just stir it up, and then you wonder why it stinks more. So the solution rarely involves a lot of thinking. Sometimes enough thinking to identify that we're afraid, that we're defending ourselves, but thinking is not the solution to a problem that was caused by a lack of love. You can summarize this pretty easily. Lies in, lies out. We learned an adage when I was just a high school student, and we were first learning to program computers. And this is back in the days when we programmed computers using punch cards, if you can imagine. We used a computer that was nearly as large as our house and used an air conditioner half as big as our house just to cool the, if you can believe it, vacuum tubes that ran the thing. And the motto was, you put poop in and you get poop out of a computer. Same is true with a child. Poop in, poop out. You injure a child, the results are fairly predictable. So we know PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's see the relationship to post-childhood stress disorder, and we can actually learn a little bit more about post-childhood. We can see also how true it is that our traumas determine how we're going to behave for the rest of our lives. So one thing that contributes to the incidence and severity of post-traumatic PTSD is that the trauma lasts a long time. And that's fairly obvious, right? I mean, if you're in a shelling in the military and bombs go off around you all night and all day, the trauma is worse than if a single bomb goes off, nearby. Well, childhood is a very long, interminable, it seems to a child, a very long time to be traumatized by the "I don't love you" message over and over and over again. If you walk through a Walmart and watch It's usually a mother, mostly because mothers usually do the shopping. It's not that mothers are more traumatizing than fathers, but watch mothers interact with their kids and watch how many times with a scowl on their face they say, no, stop it, don't do that, quit running, don't pick that up. And watch the face of the kid. The kid is just devastated. I watched a mother just berate a child for reaching outside of the, that little, they call that little front of the cart where the little kid sits with his legs dangling. And she was just beating the crap out of this kid emotionally. And he happened to look over in my direction, and I caught his eye, and I winked and just smiled. Oh, my goodness. The kid just burst into laughter. He just wanted a tender, soft moment instead of being berated for making, frankly, a negligible mistake. He touched something, if you can imagine. Children are born to touch stuff. They never quit it, in fact. And if you get a child close enough to something that shouldn't be touched, well, then it's your fault. In PTSD, the incidence is higher and the severity is worse if the trauma is repetitive, if it happens over and over again. And is there anything more repetitive than the unloving way that most children are treated by their parents? Hardly. Or if the trauma is frequent. Now, repetitive just means happens. Frequency is how quickly the event happens. So repetitive could be, say, for example, once an hour. That's repetitive. Frequent would mean once every 5 minutes. That's more frequent. That's still repetitive, but it's more frequent. And children are traumatized many, many times every day. There is little or no recovery time between emotional assaults. That's the emphasis when it says the trauma is frequent. There's no recovery time. If a soldier is wounded and then heals for a year and goes back, they do pretty well. If they're wounded and sent back into battle in an hour, the likelihood that they'll develop PTSD is very high. And children suffer this kind of trauma with pretty much no break. They're traumatized as they're put to bed crying. They're traumatized as they're woken up and told to hurry and brush their teeth and screamed at every minute until they go to school, where they get the inestimable pleasure of being yelled at by their teachers. So it just goes on and on. Repetition of multiple kinds of trauma tends to cause more PTSD. And children get traumatized in a wide variety of ways. Verbally, physically, by being ignored, sexually, by being condescended to, criticized, ordered about. I hate you. I don't care about you. You're worthless. All of this. And as I said earlier, I see people who have been severely sexually abused. I see children whose fathers, young girls whose fathers were their pimps, who sold them into prostitution. In addition to demeaning them and yelling at them. And so children just incur more varieties of trauma than just about anybody, because most adults will eventually get tired of being traumatized in certain ways and fight back. Much harder for a young child, although most children will eventually get tired of it too, and that's when they start rebelling against the trauma they're experiencing. And then we wonder why they're being rebellious when the answer is looking at us right in the mirror. PTSD occurs more commonly if it occurs at a young age. Well, that's the definition of childhood. It occurs more commonly in soldiers who have poor social support, which is a way of saying, comes from a family where there was no mother, there was no father, the kid was raised in a foster home, that kind of thing. And the lack of real love in the world is so widespread that virtually every child has a poor social support to counteract the lack of love from parents. 1/3 of children now are born into families where there's just one parent. There are as many, just happened a year or two ago, there are as many single adults now as there are married adults. This does not tend to provide an extensive social support for children. So for most children, the entire extended family came from the same emotional swamp as the parents. So the chance of getting supported by the parents are like zero. In fact, the least abusive person in the family is often regarded as loving. So all you have to do is be less abusive and you're regarded as a saint. And I see this all the time. Just the other day, a lady was telling me how loving her father was. And she went on about that. Oh, I could always count on him. He was sweet and kind. And after a while, I just put up my hand and I said, pause for a second. Impossible. She said, well, how could you know? You weren't there. I'm looking at you. There's no way that you could have been raised by an unconditionally loving father. So I asked some very specific questions. And it turned out that he was beaten by her mother every day. So what he was weak and withdrawn and a coward and afraid and wounded and so concerned with avoiding his own pain that he didn't have any energy left to cause pain for her. So it's not that he was loving, it's that he was just simply less wounding, less overtly wounding than the mother. PTSD occurs more frequently if there's no meaning to the trauma. In other words, if you're just simply senselessly kidnapped and tortured, you're more likely to get PTSD than if you are kidnapped and tortured as a prisoner of war in the cause of your country while waving your flag. Well, with children, it's impossible to identify any higher sense of purpose that is being served when they're suffering at the hand of a parent. They just are in pain. The trauma of childhood is mindless. It's crazy. So a child couldn't possibly assign meaning to that, although they do eventually come to accept it as relatively normal. PTSD occurs more often if the trauma is deliberate, if somebody intended to hurt you. It's one thing to be, say, hit by a meteor. And people feel bad, but it wasn't deliberate. Nobody meant to do it. Or a tree fell over on your house and, wounded you. But being intentionally hurt has a different emotional kind of weight. And although parents rarely hurt their children intentionally, I have yet to meet a parent who gets up in the morning and goes, I think I'm going to emotionally wound my children and put them in therapy for the rest of their lives. To the child, it certainly seems deliberate. To a child, everything that an adult does seems like they had a choice. Adults know what they're doing. So if you as an adult parent hurt your child, as far as the child was concerned, you meant to do it. PTSD occurs more commonly if the trauma is uncontrollable, if there's nothing you can do about it. Prisoners of war, for example, who are put in conditions where there's absolutely no possibility of escape. They're strapped to tables and tortured. It's much more traumatic than if they were to exert some effort, they could lessen their pain. Children feel almost entirely helpless as they're being traumatized. There's not a single thing they can do. In fact, many children learn that the very best way to minimize the trauma is to do nothing at all, is to be even more helpless. It's just the nature of childhood. The severity of the trauma, that should be fairly obvious. It's more traumatic to have two legs amputated than to have one. That would be like in a war, for example. But could there be a trauma more severe than that which we routinely inflict on the tender soul of a child? There isn't anything worse. And it really doesn't matter how the "I don't love you" was inflicted. The worst injured kids, in fact, I've talked about the fact that there are children who are sexually abused and hit and thrown downstairs and that kind of thing, or neglected. But one of the worst injuries that is now being inflicted on children at least in this country and more in countries that I have traveled to, is children who are simply indulged. So that would look like treating a child with overkindness, wouldn't it? The parents clean the child's room. Now, I'm not talking about a child who's 6 months old. I mean, I know men who are, I wish I were making this up. I know men who are 60 years old whose 84-year-old mothers still come in and clean their rooms and prepare their meals and take care of them in every way. I know parents who provide everything for their children. It sounds like a good thing. No, it's not. They do their homework. They do all the jobs around the house. I know children who have grown up all the way through childhood and gone on to school, and they've never done a job around the house. And then the child spends the rest of their life not knowing how to do anything. My children would come home from high school and say, "Dad, these kids don't know how to work." I found that sort of funny at the time because they would often complain that they had to work. But as they got older, they appreciated, even though I must, hasten to say that there were many occasions where I motivated them to work with many of the unloving behaviors, but they did learn to work. And kids who don't are destroyed. So I know a young lady who spent 20 years in the basement of her parents' house, cutting herself off from people, jobless, skillless, a hypochondriac, an absolutely hopeless life because she had been wounded by not being taught, which is part of loving. Really loving somebody means caring about their happiness, and that means teaching them how to work. Well, more and more parents are not doing that. We're raising an entire generation of entitled kids because the parents are treating their own pain, because no parent likes to see that anguished look, that that look like you're torturing them, when you assign them a job to do. Like, how could life be more unfair? PTSD is more common when parents are unstable. Well, parents who fail to unconditionally love their children are invariably emotionally unstable themselves and then have an unstable influence on their children. We talked about how PTSD is more common when the trauma has no sense of meaning, but this is different. PTSD is more common when the person who is injured has no sense of purpose. So, for example, if a soldier goes to war and their purpose in going to war is to defend their country, their honor, they're much less likely to incur PTSD than somebody who goes to war because, they're drafted or there was no other way to get a job skill or education. Those people are much more susceptible to PTSD. And with PCSD, how can we possibly have a sense of purpose if all we know is pain? So we got to have a sense of a role, a raison d'être, as the French would say, a reason to be. I knew a girl who had been sexually abused by her grandfather from age 4 to 14, I think. And of course, she'd been to many therapists and they'd all expressed their sympathy and lots of sympathy. Wow. So she'd become quite a victim, which is, understandable that you would sympathize with a, little kid who had been sexually abused at a young age like that. And certainly I felt compassion for her, but that's different from sympathy. So with my mind not being clouded by fear of possibly hurting her feelings by asking an important question, I said, "So why did you allow it to go on that long?" Now, at age 4, there isn't much a 4-year-old can do about much of anything. But at 14, why did you allow it to go on? She looked at me absolutely stunned. She said, "Nobody has." Now, mind you, she's now 40, 5 or something. She said, in all these years, nobody's ever asked me that question. Why did I allow it to go on? Because of the sympathy factor. It just absolutely clouds our judgment. And she said, I allowed it to go on because, and there was a long, long pause. And I finally said, because you liked it. And with tears just streaming down her face, she said, yeah, I did. I liked it from a lot of standpoints. For one thing, it was the only positive attention I ever got in my life. It was the only time I felt like I had a role. It was the only time I had a use. I felt important. I felt valued. I felt like I had a purpose in life. And that was from being sexually abused. So, whoa, children are in a position where we can hurt them and they can't stop it. They not only can't stop it, they won't stop it. It makes them feel useful. It gives them a place. PTSD is more common if there is pre-existing stress. And in PCSD, an unloving childhood is the stress that pre-exists pretty much everything else. So don't need to say any more about that. More, if there's an existence of an ongoing threat that the trauma will continue, PTSD is more likely. And for children, relatively weak and helpless, the trauma is almost always an ongoing threat that they can't control. How many children have told me, every single day I knew what was going to happen. Every single Friday I knew that my father was going to come home drunk, beat my mother, and when he beat my mother unconscious, then he would turn on me. Well, that's the definition of an ongoing threat. PTSD is more common if we're in a passive position rather than an active position. If you're fighting with somebody else and you get wounded in the process, well, you kind of knew that that was one of the possibilities. But if you're passive, there's not much you can do. It's just more likely that you'll get PTSD. And children are almost invariably passive recipients of trauma. When does a child true cause trauma from a parent, please? Poor self-esteem causes a greater incidence of PTSD. And children who have not been unconditionally loved uniformly have poor self-esteem. How could they have anything else? If soldiers, for example, have underdeveloped protective skills, if they were sent into battle poorly prepared, there's a higher incidence of PTSD. And inexperience and weakness are defining characteristics of childhood. Children have not learned to protect themselves. And when they do learn to protect themselves, for example, the terrible twos, when a child finally says no, well, then the parents usually, they go one of two ways. Often, they become more attacking. They simply overwhelm the child's ability to protect himself. Or the parent, because they're afraid to not be liked, they give up, they become indulgent, and the child is wounded again. PTSD is more common if there is a perception that you are responsible for the trauma or acted inappropriately. For example, if a soldier is in a situation where he made a mistake and caused the wounds that he then incurred, or perhaps even the wounds that occurred to his fellow soldiers, much more likely to get PTSD than if they did not feel responsible for the trauma. And almost without exception, children are made to feel responsible for the unkindness directed at them. They're told that they could have avoided the pain if only they had blank, cleaned their room, been more respectful, and so on. In fact, you don't really even have to specify their fault. All you have to do is be angry at a child. And the implication is, and it's pretty loudly implied, I'm angry at you. What? What's the rest of the sentence? Because of you. And so children get wounded. There's nothing that they can do about it, and they're blamed for it. Well, it's just absolutely intolerable for a child. Another condition that tends to accentuate PTSD is the perception that you are alone or isolated. Prisoners of war who are isolated suffer more PTSD than if they're with a group. And who could be more alone than a child who feels unloved? They're wounded. They have nowhere to go. Where's the higher authority? Who are they going to appeal to? The courts? Their brothers or sisters? If their father is traumatizing them, by definition, the mother's not doing anything to stop it. Now, she may not like it, but she's not. Or it could be the other way around. So people with PTSD feel wounded all the time. It's not only from past wounds like PTSD, but with PCSD, the wound is ongoing. So they have more than post-childhood stress disorder. Children have post and ongoing childhood stress disorder. And as they grow up, they're in a constant survival mode. That's what characterizes PTSD, by the way. It's essentially an elevated survival response, so that people come home from whatever trauma it was, be it a sexual assault or war or whatever, and they are hyper vigilant. They are prepared to defend themselves from deadly trauma all the time. So that you'll see soldiers who carry around their weapons after they've come home, which doesn't last very long because the police don't think very kindly of that, nor do the neighbors. And people with PTSD defend themselves sometimes with getting in protecting behaviors, sometimes just with their thoughts. So sometimes I can just take a look at somebody, and so can you. You can look at somebody and you can see, in fact, many of you who are listening right now have this characteristic. How many of you have experienced spinning thoughts in your head? You can't stop your thoughts. Your thoughts just feel like they bounce around in your head. It's like a never-ending ball of yarn that moves. You have difficulty sleeping. You have difficulty concentrating. In fact, many people who are identified as having ADD, if you take all the symptoms of ADD and you put them in a list, and then you put side by side all the symptoms of pain, they're the same. So there are increasingly pediatricians who are saying there's no such thing as ADD. There are children who are reacting normally to abnormal circumstances. So people with PTSD, their thoughts are spinning all the time. They have no concentration. They're thinking, how do I get what I want? How will this event or person hurt me? What can I do to prevent pain? What's going to happen to me for the rest of the day? What's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen if this happens? Well, what's going to happen if this and this and this and this? You can see how it spins on, and they can't stop it. It's all generated by the neurologic hyperexcitement or hypervigilance that's a natural result of pain. And we talked about that early in this lesson, how all the getting and protecting behaviors are a result of pain. So what can you do about it? Well, you can't just say to somebody, stop your spinning thoughts. Much like saying, don't think the word purple. And of course, that's what they're going to do. You can't just say, don't be in pain. You can't say to a drowning person, stop drowning. So what do? So let's look at PowerPoint that we looked at just a little bit ago, but we're going to modify it a little bit. Earlier, I said that insufficient love leads to emptiness and fear, which really are both just, forms of or cause, take your pick, pain. So insufficient love leads to pain. Well, then the solution becomes kind of obvious. Real love leads to an absence of emptiness and fear and no pain. Now, many people think, oh, well, that's really pretty naive, but I've done this now 1,000 times to see that it absolutely works. So on many occasions, I have either held somebody's hand or just sat and looked into their eyes, looked into their eyes and said absolutely nothing, or held them chest to chest and just stroked their cheek and looked at them without a word. And after several minutes of that, sometimes I'll ask, what are you afraid of? They can't think of a thing. And yet, all of the hurtful things that happened to you in your past still happened. All of the hurtful things that you have worried might happen in the future could still happen. All of the hurtful people in your life are still out there. So all the possibilities and realities of pain still exist. And yet, while you're feeling loved, you're afraid of nothing. That's really kind of amazing. Love abolishes fear. And it's absolutely counterintuitive, because when we become afraid, if there's a potential threat, what we do is go to control the threat. We go to defend ourselves. Duh. I mean, it's a reflex. And it turns out that the reflex helps us to survive in many cases. Climbing a tree quickly when a dog is about to bite you can be useful. But climbing a tree at every sound of barking would become kind of annoying. Climbing a tree at every sound would become even more annoying. And that's the effect of PTSD. We climb a tree every time anything happens. Well, if any of you have ever quickly climbed a tree, I have right now, in fact, scratches all over my arms from using the chainsaw and cutting up logs and lifting them up into a wheelbarrow and carrying them to a place and lifting them up into a pile. And the bark just shreds my arms. So it turns out that in the process of protecting ourselves, we actually hurt ourselves. And we do it all the time. And so the cycle of pain leads to more pain, to more pain, to more pain. And we defend ourselves and cause even more pain by defending ourselves. And all we do is make things worse. But we can stop it all. And it's all right here. Real love leads to the absence of emptiness and fear, which abolishes pain. No kidding. It only took me 20 years to figure out this next slide, but oh well. I'm a slow learner, but I keep going forward. And we'll go over these in future classes. But imagine just for a second that I'm holding you and that you can feel it, that you feel loved, and I'm teaching you. So one thing that you know to be true, because I've asked this of now hundreds and hundreds of people, do you know that I love you? Yes. Do I love you as a peer? No. Friend? No. Teacher? Mm-mm. No. When you love and teach somebody in a nurturing, nourishing way, for at least those moments, you become a parent. You're not replacing anybody's parent. It doesn't elevate you to any superior status. You just love them in a nurturing, unconditional, one-way flow, which is the characteristic of a parent. So, what do you know to be true? I love you. So, the first truth is, Daddy, or the person who's loving you, is a woman, mommy, or if you prefer to call them by their name, Fred, it doesn't matter. But you know one person loves you. Daddy loves me. Mommy loves me. Whoever it is that loves you, Susie. It's critical that we feel unconditionally loved by one person first. Because once we've had that feeling, once we've had the feeling of love abolishing pain and fear in our lives, it becomes much easier to experience that the second time. The first time's the trick. If you've never had it, most of us can't identify it even if it runs over us with a truck. So then I often say to people, so do you imagine that I created love? Well, ridiculous. I write books about it, but I didn't create love any more than Columbus discovered America, or created America when he landed on it. It was here long before he came. He just came and drew a map how to get here, and then of course we were inundated by crazy Europeans. So I don't create love. The love I get comes from a higher source, divine source. Some people call that God. Some people call it the universe. I don't care. Some people don't believe in a divine, unifying, caring, loving energy or being. I don't care about that either. If you don't, then skip this one. But we'll talk about this in about class number 10. I'm not going to beat that drum at this point. But there is a unifying, loving, caring influence, energy, or being. And you can call it what you want. I call it God because I don't know, it's shorter. So somebody loves me. Daddy, mommy, somebody. God loves me. If that's true, I am never alone. Wow. Just knowing that alone changes the rest of your life, because we've been suffering alone forever. Nobody's ever understood us. I looked at one woman just sitting across from her in the upstairs in the room where I usually meet with people to do interventions, and many of you have been there. And I sit in a rocking chair, I guess, because it's really comfortable. And I had my feet up on the couch next to her. And I said, honey, you've been alone all your life. She started to cry. And I said, but I get you. I understand you. I get you, and I don't need to hear all the details of your life, like with that woman who, on the third day of her intervention, I never even asked her a question about her past, but I still understood her. We don't need the details. And then she just bawled. We want so much for somebody to get us, to understand us. Feeling alone is horrible. There was a really popular movie several years ago called Contact, and it was about, it's a science fiction movie about how a signal was sent out into space long ago, and aliens responded to it and sent a message back, and it turns out that in the message were instructions about how to build an enormous machine that would, zip through wormholes. And, if you're a Star Trek fan, you're just really loving this. And if you're not, you don't know what I'm talking about. But it instantly took the passenger hundreds of light years from here, which is quite a feat, since most of us in a few seconds can, with my knees, I can travel a good 6 yards in that many seconds. So she goes hundreds of light years, and she meets one of these alien beings. And she asks, why did you do this? Why did you build a machine that would enable us to come this huge distance just to meet you? And his response was, you feel so alone. And you're not. Most of us suffer from severe loneliness. Even when we're in a crowd, we feel alone. In fact, you feel more alone in a crowd because now your loneliness is highlighted by the fact that there are people around you and you still don't feel connected to anybody. So if somebody loves you, somebody loves me, God loves me, I'm never alone, because I can either call upon those sources to love me again, or I can simply, wherever I am, remember it And I can create it just as real as though I were right there. I've had people call me and say, I was going to a job interview and I became afraid. And all I did was say, Daddy loves me. God loves me. I'm never alone. They go into the job interview. They do fine. The fear is gone, which brings us to number 4. I have everything I need and nothing to fear. If you have love, you've got it all, honey. And you got nothing to fear, because if you know that I love you for sure, and I'm just a mortal, stupid, flawed human being, and God loves you, and there are other people around you who loves you, it doesn't matter who doesn't. So if you have people who really do care about you and you're never alone, and somebody comes along and says, I hate you, the very worst that they can do is not add to your love. So what? You won't be exchanging Christmas cards. But they can't take love from you. They can't take peace from you. And if the first 4 are true, somebody loves me, God loves me, I'm never alone, I have everything I need, nothing to fear, well, wow, I'm so grateful. Makes all the difference in the world. Because once I can get to grateful, I can't be unhappy anymore. No kidding. I'm invincible. Nobody can touch me. And we have to get to this condition first. People will often say, well, I don't have time to do this real love stuff. No, you don't have time not to do it. Because as long as you act in fear, things are going to go badly. And even if they go apparently well, I was a wealthy, successful surgeon and I had a gun to my head. Even if they appear to go well, they won't make you happy. So sometimes we have to just stop accomplishing tasks and feel loved and be loving first. I had a lady recently whose thoughts were spinning, like we were talking about. So I knew she was afraid. I knew she felt traumatized. I knew she was protecting herself. And I said, stop thinking. She said, well, how do I do that? I said, look at me. What am I doing? Took her a while, took her several stabs, sitting in your chair. No. She said, you're loving me. Yes. I said, that's the only thing you need to do right now is feel loved. She said, well, I have all these things to do. They don't matter. She said, well, isn't that irresponsible if I just don't do these things that I agreed to do? So let's say that it's your job to drive on a road from point A to point B. But you get a flat tire. Is it irresponsible to stop on your journey and fix the flat tire? No, it's not. We have to stop whatever we're doing until we can feel loved, and then we can continue. And the power of it is incredible. I have a security program on my computer that weeds out viruses and all those other little nasty little things that apparently lurk out in the electronic universe. And it's called Norton Antivirus. And I love their slogan. Norton protects you while you sleep. Without your being aware of it, it's in the background protecting you, screening every email, screening every program, screening, watching, protecting over you. And that's the effect of love. Once you feel loved, in fact, many potential threats just disappear from your view. Or they're gone entirely because you realize that they were illusions anyway. When you feel love, there's no more complaining. Everything becomes more peaceful, calmer, quieter, more productive, happier. And yet, real love doesn't always work, not with every person. So why is that? One word. And we're going to talk a whole lot more about this in sessions to come. But the word is trust. When people come here, I tell them I'm going to do 2 things. And in fact, I'm going to tell you the same thing. starting with last week, continuing to this week, and continuing for the next 8 weeks that we meet, I'm only going to do 2 things with you. I will love you, and I mean really care about you. You don't have to be here for that to happen. In fact, I can love you without meeting you. I can love you without knowing your name. And I will teach you. So I will love and teach you. And you have a responsibility to do only one thing if you want your life to change. If you don't have to do anything. But if you'd like to be happier, you only need to trust. Trust what? Trust real love, trust the principles, trust the process. No, actually, for practical purposes, just for the time that we spend together, just trust me. Now, why me? Well, because I'm the one talking to you. If it was somebody else that was doing the webinar, I would say trust them. I'm all I've got to offer you. I'm the only person I really have a right to offer you. Trust me to what? Trust me to know what I'm doing, because I've been doing this a long time with a lot of people in a lot of countries and seen it work absolutely consistently. And trust me that I care about you. What do you got to lose? One lady said, well, why should I trust you? I don't know enough about you. Well, I couldn't make it worse. You're already unhappy and lost and miserable. So why not do this? I got a letter from a woman just 3 days ago, I think. And I'm going to read it to you because it illustrates well what we're talking about. She said, yesterday I learned for the first time what it feels like to trust. Now, this is a woman that I have worked with on and off for years, talking about trust the whole while. And yet she says, yesterday I learned for the first time what it feels like to trust. Hey, it takes what it takes. If you've been injured all your life by human beings, especially by human beings who were in positions of authority and who said they knew what they were talking about, then why would you trust me when I say trust me? Another adult in an apparent position of authority or a position of knowledge or whatever. Why? Well, what do you got to lose, for one thing? Second, been doing this a long time. Third, try it, and you'll feel that there's a reason to trust. You'll feel it. Now, it took this lady years. It'll take you as long as it takes. It may take you years. You may be able to do it right now. She said, I learned what it feels like to trust. I went to my student teaching orientation yesterday and started to doubt myself. I asked, how am I going to be able to meet these high expectations with student teaching, take care of my daughter, Susie, as a single mother, move out of my parents' place, move into my own apartment? How am I going to be able to do all this at the same time? And after I reasoned it all out in my head and tried to find proof that I couldn't do it, all the reasons how it would fail, and pretty much gave up, I texted you, meaning me, because she's writing a letter to me. You wrote back with one sentence. She said one sentence, but she's not real good at math. It's actually 2 sentences. Trust, honey. Just trust and don't think. That's what I wrote her. She continues. I realized the problem once again was my lack of trust, not how was I going to do everything. It's trust, not how. As soon as I chose to recognize that truth, that I could trust your love for me and trust my abilities because you told me I could, my course was plotted. I remembered all the blessings that I've already been given, and I knew I already had my answer. Only through effort and commitment, which are natural products of trust, will I arrive at happiness. only by accepting the obstacles I'll encounter, like you said, and making the choice to believe I can conquer whatever challenge comes along while I make it. More simply put, I will make it only as I trust. I'm still quoting her. But I'm not doing it alone. You're with me all the time. And let me parenthetically say that she lives 1,000 miles from here. She says, you're with me all the time. I instantly felt more confident. You help me see that you have faith in me. You have trust in someone, she's referring to herself, who has demonstrated considerable, she capitalized that, instability. And you still have had faith in my judgment over and over, even when I was wrong. It's an example of a parent like I've never known. I was really grateful that I trusted. She's much happier. So I have no sense of ego about this. This isn't about me. I can love 20 people and 2 will be trusting and those people will change. 18 people won't. So it's not about me. So when somebody writes and says, oh, thank you, you've changed my life. Well, you're welcome, but it's about you. It's about you trusting. It's about your being willing to say that you're feeling loved, that you don't have to be alone anymore, that you have everything you've ever needed, that you don't have to suffer, that finally, instead of suffering and being in pain, you're grateful. And as you come to that last one, I am so grateful, your life will entirely change. You'll enjoy what you're doing. You'll do it better. You'll feel more connected to other people. In the end, you'll just be happier. So I look forward to talking to you again in a week. We're going to talk about, actually, I can't remember, but we'll find out in a week. So it's good being with you. I love you. Look forward to talking to you then.